Imagine a country so wealthy its citizens paid no taxes, enjoyed free healthcare, education, and housing, and had the highest per capita income on the entire planet. Now, imagine that same country, just a few decades later, its landscape decimated, its future uncertain, and its economy almost entirely dependent on hosting a controversial detention center for another nation's asylum seekers. This isn't science fiction. It's the real story of Nauru, a tiny island in the Pacific. Today, on G Fun Facts Online, we're exploring the dizzying rise and devastating fall of Nauru, a tale of two fortunes that serves as one of the world's most dramatic and tragic cautionary tales. For millennia, Nauru was a lush tropical oasis inhabited by 12 indigenous clans. When the first European visitor, British Captain John Fern, arrived in 1798, he was so impressed he named it Pleasant Island. But its pleasant isolation was irrevocably shattered in the year 1900. A prospector named Albert Ellis discovered that the island was almost entirely made of high-grade phosphate rock. This wasn't just any rock. It was the result of centuries upon centuries of bird droppings or guano mineralizing on the island's coral limestone base. This white gold was a key ingredient in superphosphate fertilizer, a commodity in high demand by agricultural nations like Australia and New Zealand. What followed was a century of intensive, destructive mining. Colonial powers moved in, first Germany, and then, after World War I, a consortium of Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. This consortium formed the British Phosphate Commission, or BPC, which managed the extraction with ruthless efficiency. They systematically strip-mined the island's interior, scraping away the topsoil and phosphate, leaving behind a barren, jagged landscape. While immense profits flowed to the colonial administrators and their home countries, the Nauruan people, the traditional landowners, received only a pittance in royalties for the permanent destruction of their homeland. When Nauru finally gained its independence in 1968, it took control of its own destiny and its one massive resource. The new government purchased the assets of the British Phosphate Commission and began managing the phosphate industry for its own benefit. This single act ushered in an era of unprecedented, almost unimaginable wealth. With revenues soaring to between 100 and 120 million Australian dollars annually throughout the 1970s and 80s, Nauru's small population of just a few thousand people became, on paper, the richest citizens on Earth. The government established a comprehensive welfare state that was the envy of the world. Healthcare was free and high quality. Education was free, including all expenses for Nauruans to attend university anywhere in the world. Housing was provided by the state. There were no taxes. Tales of the era's extravagance became legendary. The national airline, Air Nauru, at one point had a fleet of 7 Boeing jets, enough to transport the entire population of the island at once, often flying with just a handful of passengers on shopping trips to Hawaii or Singapore. Nauruans famously purchased expensive sports cars, like Lamborghinis and Ferraris, which were utterly impractical for an island with a single 19-kilometer-long ring road. For a brief, shining moment, Nauru was a paradise funded by phosphate. But even in the boom years, the government knew the phosphate wouldn't last forever. In 1968, they wisely established the Nauru Phosphate Royalties Trust, or NPRT. This was a sovereign wealth fund intended to invest the phosphate profits and secure the nation's future for all generations to come. At its peak in 1991, the fund was estimated to be worth a staggering 1.3 billion Australian dollars. This trust was supposed to be Nauru's permanent safety net. Instead, it became a textbook example of what economists call the resource curse. The resource curse describes a paradox where countries with an abundance of natural resources often have worse economic outcomes and less democracy than countries with fewer resources. The massive influx of easy money from phosphate created a culture of dependency. The government became the primary employer, and there was little incentive for private enterprise to develop. The nation's entire economy was balanced on a single commodity. The NPRT, meant to protect against this, was ultimately destroyed by a toxic combination of spectacular mismanagement, comically ill-advised investments, and rampant corruption. The Trust's portfolio of disastrous ventures is almost hard to believe. Perhaps the most infamous was its decision to finance a London West End musical called Leonardo the Musical, A Portrait of Love. The show was a critical and commercial flop, closing after just a few weeks and losing millions of dollars. The Trust also invested heavily in luxury properties around the world, including hotels in the US, UK, and Australia, and a prized piece of real estate in Melbourne which became Nauru House. For a time, it was the tallest building in the city, a symbol of Nauru's incredible wealth. But like the other investments, it was poorly managed and eventually had to be sold off at a massive loss to cover the nation's spiraling debts. By the early 2000s, as the primary phosphate reserves were finally exhausted, the trust had all but collapsed. Nauru, once the richest country in the world, was on the brink of bankruptcy. Facing total economic collapse, the nation became desperate. For a brief, ill-fated period in the 1990s, Nauru tried to reinvent itself as an offshore tax haven. It sold Nauruan passports and established hundreds of shell banks that existed only on paper, becoming a hub for international money laundering. This move led to the country being blacklisted by international financial institutions, plunging it further into crisis. Then, in 2001, a new and deeply controversial lifeline appeared. The Australian government, under Prime Minister John Howard, implemented its hardline Pacific Solution immigration policy, designed to deter asylum seekers from arriving by boat. Australia needed a third country to send these people for processing. Nauru, in exchange for millions in financial aid and the cancellation of its debts, agreed to host an offshore processing center. It was a Faustian bargain, a trade of national sovereignty and moral standing for economic survival. Since that agreement, the detention center has become the undeniable cornerstone of Nauru's economy. In some years, direct payments and visa fees from Australia have accounted for more than half of the Nauruan government's total income. In the 2019-20 fiscal year, revenue from the Regional Processing Center, as it's officially known, constituted 58% of the government's total revenue, amounting to approximately 150 million Australian dollars. The center is also the largest source of employment on the island, with many Nauruans working as guards, drivers, and support staff. Local businesses have thrived by leasing vehicles, property, and services to the Australian-funded contractors running the facility, often at inflated prices. This economic lifeline, however, has come at a profound and devastating human cost. The conditions within the Nauruan detention facility have been widely and repeatedly condemned by the United Nations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and numerous medical bodies. These organizations have detailed a litany of abuses, including severe neglect, inhumane treatment, and a deliberate policy of cruelty designed to deter other asylum seekers. The most catastrophic impact has been on the mental health of the men, women, and children held in indefinite detention. Medical experts from Médecins Sans Frontières describe the level of psychological suffering on Nauru as beyond desperate, with detainees being among the most traumatized people they had ever seen. Rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation are astronomically high. Children have been reported to suffer from a rare and life-threatening condition called traumatic withdrawal syndrome, or resignation syndrome, where they become catatonic, refuse to eat or drink, and require emergency medical evacuation. Self-harm and suicide attempts have become tragically frequent occurrences. Beyond the psychological torment, the physical conditions have been heavily criticized for overcrowding, insufficient sanitation, and exposure to extreme heat in canvas tents. Access to adequate medical care has been a persistent issue, with credible reports of long delays and outright denials for treatment of even life-threatening conditions. Furthermore, refugees and asylum seekers have reported frequent and unpunished assaults, including sexual assault, by some members of the local population, and even by guards at the center. This has created a climate of fear that often prevents people from leaving their accommodations. Australia has long argued that it does not have jurisdiction over what happens in a sovereign nation like Nauru. However, the UN Human Rights Committee has firmly rejected this claim, ruling that under international law, Australia remains responsible for the well-being of the asylum seekers it forcibly transfers there. For the Nauruan people, the detention center presents a complex and contradictory reality. On one hand, it is an undeniable economic necessity. For many local business owners and workers, it represents a revival of fortune in a country with few other options. On the other hand, the presence of the facility has created significant social tensions. While some Nauruans are employed by the center, there have been numerous reports of hostility directed at the refugees. For those refugees who are eventually granted some freedom of movement on the island, life remains a desperate struggle. They often face poverty, living on a meager allowance that is insufficient to cover the high cost of living, and report difficulties accessing adequate food and basic necessities. The long-term sustainability of this detention-based economy is incredibly precarious. The number of detainees has fluctuated over the years based on the political winds in Canberra, and with it, the revenue Nauru receives. The center was even briefly empty in 2023, sparking fears of economic collapse before new arrivals were transferred. Nauru's government has expressed a commitment to economic diversification, with potential avenues including developing a deep-sea fishing industry and the rehabilitation of mined-out lands. But the challenges are immense. The environmental devastation from a century of phosphate mining is almost total. Up to 80% of the island's interior is now a barren moonscape of limestone pinnacles, a jagged, unusable wasteland. This makes agriculture or large-scale development nearly impossible. Tourism is a distant prospect given the remote location and ruined landscape. Nauru's future seems inextricably linked to its powerful neighbor, Australia. The relationship is one of profound codependency, with Nauru reliant on Australian aid and Australia dependent on Nauru to maintain its controversial immigration policies, effectively making Nauru a client state. From the heights of unimaginable wealth to the depths of economic and environmental ruin, Nauru's story serves as a stark and tragic cautionary tale. It is a testament to the destructive power of the resource curse, and a somber reflection of the human cost of political expediency. As the world grapples with forced migration and climate change, the future of this tiny island nation, once called Pleasant Island, remains a poignant and unresolved question. Thanks for tuning in to G Fun Facts Online.